For many of us, virtual reality and immersive technologies are nothing more than the latest trend in video games. But for our guests today, they are cutting-edge tools that are transforming medical care for patients and neurosurgeons, saving and improving lives. With us today are Drs. Ahmed and Gal, all renowned for their medical expertise, but also valued for helping their organizations and humankind leap into the digital future. Welcome to you both.
Thank you, and welcome.
Thank you.
So excited to have you with us today. Dr. Gal, let me start off with you. How are you seeing immersive technologies changing patient care today? And which technologies, from your perspective, have the most promise for us?
So the way I see it is that there's actually a whole spectrum of applications when it comes to immersive technology, ranging all the way from medical education, where we train medical students, nursing students, allied health, or even junior residents, all the way to using it in the operating theater, using it on the floor, in front of patients, and with patient fronting applications as well. And the thing is that looking at all the different devices, technology, when it comes to immersive technology at this point in time, I think that individual components and individual devices, they have their own areas of expertise, or in terms of areas of use when it comes to different applications. I don't think that there is one device that I would consider having a tremendous advantage over the other. Although nowadays, with the introduction of mixed reality devices, like for example the Magic Leap or the HoloLens 2, they do augment or enhance a little bit more of the devices that we've been using previously. But the thing is that I think at the end of the day, we have to sort of decide how we want to use these devices and to play to their strength, while knowing some of the weaknesses and some of the potential downsides of each individual area. For example, virtual reality, we've been using VR devices for decades, right? So we are all quite familiar with it. It's very good for education. It's very good for training, medical students, surgical trainees. We immerse them in a completely virtual environment that we can create, and essentially, they can immerse themselves fully into a scenario without any interference from the outside world. But we also know that devices like this does have some of its downsides. For example, motion sickness, the inability to actually correlate what they see in the virtual world with the real world. These are some difficulties that we have faced, even now with the new VR devices. And I think part of the solution to this is with the new augmented reality devices and even mixed reality devices, where we try and incorporate a little bit of the virtual world with the real world, giving us a little bit more perspective of how we can actually integrate these two together and bring about the enhanced use of this immersive technology.
Dr. Ahmed, we see this range. We're talking about virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality. There's a lot of AI being thrown on top of that, new technologies, including hardware. What challenges are you seeing that these technologies might be able to help us solve?
So I guess following on from Gal's opening statement, there is a range of applications. So a few years ago, the concept of virtual therapy came in. So using virtual reality as a medicine, as a tool, like a drug, for example. That was a new concept. And what we're seeing now are clinical trials involving thousands of patients across the world, looking at how we can apply therapy in virtual reality. So, for example, we've seen it being used in post-traumatic stress disorders, anxieties and phobias, for example. We've been seeing it used to manage hypertension, that's high blood pressure, because it's about this whole concept of calming therapy, being involved in a virtual environment. We've seen it used as anesthesia almost to overcome pain relief. For example, the very first examples of where virtual therapy came in was when they created something called the Snow World. So patients who had burns or suffer with burns, obviously it's a very hot environment and they have their bandages, etc., trying to help them with their burns. But as they were taking those bandages off, they were playing VR games. It's called Snow World. We could throw snowballs at kind of these animals or objects within a snow environment, making it cool. That allowed people to have their dressing changes, but require less painkillers, less opioids, less side effects, for example. That was the first time we saw that. Now we're seeing now, for example, in labour. So women, for example, during labour, they can actually opt to have virtual therapy as opposed to an epidural with all its intended consequences. Of course, that's small scale, but we are seeing now more and more utilization of those therapy. And my colleagues in Cedars-Sinai, Brent Spiegel, and the team from Diane Juris in Belgium are doing a lot of work around hypnotherapy and all that kind of thing, and perhaps even doing a surgical operation just using VR therapy to over the anesthesia. So that's the whole concept of virtual rehabilitation, virtual therapy, and it's great. I think in rehab for patients with stroke, for example, for post-orthopedic surgery, for example, could see that in the future. Then the whole side of kind of the surgical workplace is changing. If you look at the OR is now, again, evolving from being analog to become digital. So for many years, we've heard the term digital health. Actually, the last few years, we've seen the kind of explosion of a new term called digital surgery, which are a new concept of what we're going to be doing as surgeons in the workplace. What we're seeing now, of course, in the OR is more digitization, people using VR and XR tools to allow them to, for example, navigate a surgical operation. So you can actually bring in those images from MRIs, CTs through DICOM images, overlay in real time for a patient. So you can plan, for example, an orthopedic operation or spinal surgery or neurosurgery, for example, to make it more precise. You can also, in some cases, as the team in Japan called HoloEyes are doing, my colleague called Maki Sugimoto and his team, they're overlaying real-time MRIs and CTs as you're operating. So theoretically, as we go forward, we can see surgical navigation. So during the operation, be navigating through an operation, avoiding important structures that you shouldn't damage, maybe taking out tumors so that you have wide margins to visualize those things. We've never had those abilities to navigate through an operation. It's based on intuition and knowledge of surgery. So we're seeing all those elements come in now to help support. And last minute, the whole process of education, I run Medical Realities. We're an XR company for the last 6-7 years. And we've been building tools around educational content. What does VR look like? It's a remote collaborative platform, so you can communicate with each other as your avatars, your holograms are being remote. As you see in the picture behind me is my avatar from 2017, where I connected with avatars across the world in real time in the XR space, doing essentially having a meeting in the operating theatre, getting advice. So this could be a new way of what's called a multi-disciplinary team meeting. And we've now become more remote with Zoom and Teams, for example. Next step is to be able to actually converse, interact with one another around this concept. So we are seeing those ideas kind of manifest themselves. So I think it's really exciting.
It is very exciting. I can hear the excitement in your voice. I personally am excited because it opens up the world, I think, of healthcare and the betterment of all of us as humankind. Now we no longer have boundaries in terms of what kind of access we can get to healthcare. But I think I would also be amiss to not ask, amongst all of this excitement, how are you being supported from a policy perspective? Are we seeing, laws and regulations keep up? Are we starting to think about XR as a medical device? How is that working? Are you seeing a partnership come in place to really support your innovation and your advancements?
A few, I think, concerns raised by XR, as we all know, it's new technology. Is it a medical device? Does it have to ensure compliance, HIPAA compliance, all the things you might think about when you're doing XR training? Thankfully, we're now seeing standards formed. One for developing XR, that's called Open XR, and finally, there are standards available to ensure that what you're creating follows strict guidelines and rules so that there's interoperability, that you can actually go from one platform to the other. That's the first thing. Secondly, in healthcare specifically, obviously there's issues around patient confidentiality, around consent, etc., data transfer, data acquisition, and storage. What we're seeing now, of course, is the open, so it's called XRSI. It's an agency in the US now creating standards across safety to ensure that what we're doing is compliant. It follows the regulatory framework in each country, so that what we're doing should be now amenable to oversight and to hit those standards across the framework, but also from health and security standards. So we are seeing now the ecosystem developing where we're building these tools in a framework that's much more safer for the patients and also helpful for clinicians like me to ensure that we are as careful as we can be when introducing these tools. So I think we are in a better place now with people now understanding the risks involved and more importantly, how to put framework around that to mitigate those risks as far as possible. So I think that's a good kind of direction we're going on.
Dr. Gao, are you seeing the same thing? Because to me, and I appreciate you mentioning actually, Dr. Ahmed, the XRSI, only because I also sit as an advisor to that organization. I didn't want to self-promote, but you did that nicely for me. But I'm wondering, Dr. Gao, to me, it seems like if we have industry standards, it not only makes it a more confident environment for surgeons and regulators, but also for patients. It increases the trust, and we can feel more comfortable. How are you seeing that evolve from your perspective?
Yeah, no, so I completely agree with what Professor Ahmed said in a sense that this is a new area for healthcare. It has been around for some time, but the thing is that it has never been deployed or used in a scale that we are currently planning to or hoping to deploy in the future. Where we can connect, like what Professor Ahmed said, different surgeons, clinicians from around the world in the same space, to create what I guess some would call a healthcare metaverse, where everyone exists both in the virtual and the physical world. And the thing is that, healthcare as a fraternity, we are always very careful. Every time we do something new or we try and change practice, we always have to have solid evidence. We need to have literature. We need to have peer reviews, guidelines, and things like that. All in the name of patient safety, right? Because at the end of the day, we have to make sure that whatever we do in the hospital, in the clinics, and when we attend to patients, we do not compromise their care. So the thing is that when it comes to immersive technology, XR, when it really depends on the area that we're using it on. So for example, if let's say we use this for surgical education or surgical pre-planning, right? Because there's no direct patient contact, you are essentially just doing a pre-procedure discussion. You're looking at scans, pretty much how we do things on a normal computer, but now you're doing it with immersive technology, with 3D renderings, holograms, and it gives the user a much better perspective and a much better understanding of the, for example, anatomy of the liver or anatomy of the brain, right? But it still remains in very much the education and the non-patient contact kind of environment. But the moment we bring this into a patient interventional role, then things kind of change, right? Because now then we are sort of blurring the lines between, for example, the AR, VR, XR devices. Are they just simply display platforms, like, for example, a laptop or computer screen? Or are we actually using this as for surgical navigation devices, like for example, devices from Medtronic, devices from BrainLab? Do we then consider this device as a medical device or a standard or a generic, mounted display, right? Because the regulations and the licenses are very different. For example, if let's say we have a rendering software that we use on a computer, right? We have to license the rendering software to make sure that it's accurate. We have to get FDA, CE medical, or any other licenses from the relevant countries, right? But we do not actually license the computer that we view it on, right? I don't have to license my laptop to say that, it can use this rendering software. So I think the same thing applies for XR devices. When do we cross the line between just a head-mounted computer into a medical device? And I think once we cross that line, we have to be very careful about how are we actually going to validate and make sure that it's safe, right? And this is where things like validation trials, validation studies, comparison studies with the current gold standards, how do we measure up, what if the device fails halfway during a surgery? Are there any backups, things like that? So I think these are the areas where there's not a lot of legislation or regulations on at this point in time because it's just so new. But it is an area that we do need to quickly develop on because, the rest of the medical world is catching on very quickly in terms of immersive devices and XR technology. And, we can't have a situation where, these devices and technologies are used without proper governance, without proper guidelines, and you may end up in situations where there may be improper use, or there may be situations where patients' safety may be compromised because it just wasn't used correctly. So echoing what Professor Ahmed said is that the work is being done, but we do feel that more work needs to be done much quicker in order to catch up with the rate at which the world is adopting this technology in terms of healthcare. Yeah.
And Dr. Gao, I can't help but think to myself, also, what type of education should we be thinking about for patients? Because I was speaking with my mom last night and she was really excited, right? I was explaining to her how this could possibly be used in context of a trauma, perhaps, where, we're doing all kinds of assessments and we're out to the hospital and, we really understand and maybe shave seconds, if you will, of an intervention, which can save a life. And she was really excited. But then I was talking to my neighbor who said, I don't want any of that. It sounds like Black Mirror. So it seems like there's a really, kind of curve, if you will, adoption curve, not just for surgeons and for policymakers, but really for citizens and for patients. And so what should we be thinking about doing right now to really help everybody understand, not be afraid, and start to feel more comfortable with what's coming, and maybe even technologies that are already being used that people aren't even aware are being used in the surgical theater?
Yeah, so I think it's very much of continued exposure to the patient population, because if, let's say, they have never heard about XR technology or immersive technology, and they come to my clinic and I say, put this on, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen, right? There will naturally be that initial apprehension as to, oh, what are you giving me? What am I going to see? What's going to happen? But if, let's say, this is, for example, a mainstream device, and the patients have seen it multiple times. They see it in the TV, in the shows, they read about it, and so when they come to experience it, even if, let's say, it's for the first time, it's not a completely new experience in a sense. They kind of have an idea of what to expect, and I think that sort of lowers a lot of the barriers and initial guards that they may have at the start. And this is kind of what we found out as well when we started using this. So we initially started showing patients their own scans using HoloLens, right? So we did some trials on patient counseling for their surgeries and everything, and we used to upload the raw CT scans, MRI scans, and we realized that for scans of the abdomen, when we try and show them for liver surgeries, for colon surgeries, we didn't have much of a adverse reaction from the patients, right? Because essentially they're just looking at a grayscale image. They can scroll through it with their virtual box and everything. They see it as a hologram, so it's kind of cool to them. But what we found out was that when we use this on patients going for neurosurgery or plastics and reconstructive surgery, especially facial trauma patients, we had a very different reaction from a lot of the patients, because what they saw was a holographic representation of their head. And essentially it's looking at a mirror, but not a mirror, right? And I think that a lot of our patients were actually not comfortable, or they felt a little bit uneasy looking at their own scan, because it just looks so real to them. It's like seeing a replica or a a digital twin to the patient. So that was kind of a interesting feedback that we had from the start, and we realized that maybe the patients are not ready for things like that. So what we did next was that instead of showing them the raw scans, we ran it through our rendering software, and it looked more like a segmented scan, like more of a computer generated image. So it removes a little bit of the realism, but it keeps the details, and we find that patients are a lot more accepting of that, right? So I think a lot of it is about slowly introducing technologies like this as the norm, so that maybe perhaps the next generation that's growing up now, when they come and see us in the clinics, they know that this is a technology that's going to be used, right? And this is just for patient counseling. Like what Professor Ahmed mentioned previously, VR rehab, we can use this for patients with PTSD, for patients who have had severe trauma before. There's many groups who are working on using immersive technology to try and help to overcome childhood neuropsychiatric disorders like dyslexia or any of the other neuropsychiatric issues that children may face. And they've had tremendous results using virtual reality to help these kids overcome some of the barriers and some of the issues that they had. So I think in terms of using this not just for the physicians to augment, a surgery or to augment the practice. A lot of it can actually be brought to a patient fronting kind of a service, meaning that the patient gets to use it themselves so that they have a better understanding of the clinical condition. They have a better understanding of what kind of surgery they're going for, why are certain surgeries more complex than the other. And these are things that we are trying, or we are sort of doing at this point in time, but it's just that without immersive technology, without three-dimensional graphics, there are some information that's a little bit more difficult for us to explain to a patient, because I think most humans are still very visual creatures. We depend on what we see to understand a little bit more of what's going on. So I think this is an area where this technology is very, very helpful when it comes to patient care.
And Dr. Ahmed, does that mean that we're going to be seeing sometime very soon an extension of healthcare into the home, where we might actually not have a pre-consultation or pre-surgical consultation in a physician's office, but we're actually going to be seeing, the surgeon remotely, maybe from my home or from my office? How do you see this happening? Because it seems a little bit of science fiction, but it seems a lot excitement, quite frankly, because I'm envisioning I never have to get in my car again, which is great, no traffic.
So that's a really good question. I think one of the things that's has been really encouraging from the pandemic is the fact that we have been more remote. We've offered more virtual healthcare. And actually, it's a shame we hadn't done it before, because now it's the patient's convenience. It's at home. It's accessible anytime without the car parking charges, the waits and delays in hospital. So I think it's a natural flow where we are in terms of virtual healthcare. Take one step forward from accessing Teams or Zoom or platforms such as this, where we can see people one another. Can we then get to the next level of have these remote collaborations with avatars or your holograms, etc.? It's still, I think, a future concept. There's a lot of work to be done in terms of to ensure that it's compliant, the patients are happy with it. There's enthusiasm from all the healthcare providers, so that it becomes more commonplace. I can envision a time, maybe the next 5-10 years, where you could opt to have a telephone call or a Zoom call or a Teams call, something like that, and also opt to have a virtual call with a virtual consult. One of the things that we've seen in terms of healthcare costs is that we've got to get away from bricks and mortar. It's very expensive. Face-to-face is very expensive. And we need a smarter solution to healthcare. Does this offer an opportunity? I think it does. One of many opportunities, whether it's remote monitoring of chronic diseases, whether it's telehealth or teletriage. This kind of XR health also adds value. And to take it one step further about what we can expect in the future. So I've been appointed as what's called the Chief Medical Metaverse Officer, the first one in the world, for a company who's building a healthcare city in the metaverse called AI Medis. And we're trying to grapple around the concept of what does that look like? What does a healthcare city look like in the metaverse? What does that physical and digital world mean to people? How do we create a kind of a system or a society using tokens, using Web3, using different ways of monetizing, different ways of accessing data, NFTs, etc. What does that look like as a new healthcare city? So we're trying to understand that more. And as time goes on, hopefully I'll share experiences with you about what we're trying to create. We've got 5-6 partnerships already in place to build this. And we just had a land sale this month for people who are interested in the pre-sale, for example. So this is still learning. So I can't tell you what the answers are. I can tell you that this is the direction of flow. And I think that it'll be another option for patients to support and be part of. Back to the question you asked about patients, it's absolutely vital. You take patients on the journey with these technologies. You can't enforce things. You shouldn't be in a position where hierarchical and say, hey, this is new, we're going to drive it forward. No, I think it's very important to have patients on their journey, have their voice, to understand where there's an advantage. Is it actually part of technology? Is there an advantage for patients? Will they prefer it? Is experience going to be good enough? Are they going to be happy with the technology, access to connectivity and technology? Again, that might actually deter some people. Who knows? But it's important, all stakeholders, and more important, the patients are involved in that conversation. I'm very much in favor of having that whole patient healthcare partnership always to ensure that what we're doing is for the right reasons and to ensure the security and compliance and all the issues that the patient might worry about. The last thing I'll talk about is the data. And data has always been a crucial part of this healthcare. And we haven't really understood how data could be shared. We seem to kind of go around the edges of that conversation. We're a bit scared about confronting it head on. And maybe in the future, with this kind of virtual world, with the NFTs, etc., might be a model where data is much more secure. You can share it openly. You can make sure that you own it and maybe monetize it. Let's have that conversation. We don't seem to be able to have those difficult conversations around data. So the virtual world we're talking about going forward is not just about a virtual consult. It's the entire ecosystem that's being built around that. What does that look like? Well, we'll have the conversation every year until we kind of figure it out, I'm guessing.
That's actually a wonderful baseline, if you will, and a great prompt for me to include into our conversation at this moment, Dr. Schrijven, who's joined us. And so we'll pause and put her on screen and ask her for her insights and experience around video consultation and her recent article in Nature Medicine. There she is. Welcome.
Yeah, I'm a bit late, but clinic calls, so I'm happy to join a bit later on.
Priorities. We appreciate you making time for us, especially since you are on call and very busy. But you know what? You appeared at the right moment because we were just talking about the extension. There you go. We were just talking about the extension of the clinical environment involving of patients. And you've written recently for Nature Medicine an interesting article around video consultation. And Dr. Ahmed was just talking about video consultation. What does that mean? And all of the other considerations that surround that. So would love to hear your perspective and see how you're seeing the evolution of technologies to support remote consultations with patients?
Yeah, great question. Well, I really am a virtual surgeon for many patients. I know Shafi's last name is virtual surgeon in many social channels. But yes, indeed. I mean, I see patients for the first time in the OR in physics. And we previously thought that wouldn't be accepted by patients at all. But, COVID pandemic has forced us more or less on the way of using technology for the better. We must, I think, now be very watchful, waiting that we do not revert back to what's pleasant for physicians. They have not become a physician to be behind a computer. They want to interact with patients in real life. But is it still the way to go? And what we wrote about in Nature Medicine is how we scaled up in 2 weeks for the whole of our university hospital, which is a very large hospital in the Netherlands, is of our main capital. Patients couldn't visit. But what we did is we made sure that the infrastructure was very much aligned with the natural workflow of the physician. So you could consult your patient using the same platform as you do in your patient care. And on the other side, the patient did not have to download different apps or anything. They could just go through their patient portal as well to visit their practitioner. And that had two very big implications. The first, that it also speeded up the process of having patients onboarded on the digital platform, so they could actually have a consultation with the practitioner. Which is a side catch, but a very important side catch if you want to disclose your digital technology towards the patients via a secure channel, which they know, with the electronic patient channel of the hospital. And the other very big win of that was that the video consultation is now inside the patient file. So you can always access what has been said and what has been done later on. And it's a very big win. It also spiked enormous interest in the hospitals around us. Also in our IT department, thinking, is this the best way to do it? We bought several lines, but those lines were in use during working hours and not in use during night hours. So it became very costly. And we have reverted to use of Teams with a good Epic integration. Can also be done using Zoom with a good Epic integration. And those are all compliant integrations. So the process evolves, but I think a very good thing to realize is use the natural workflow of both patients and practitioners. Don't assume that it won't be accepted by patients. If you consult them very well, you can even do, very severe messages. So I have to take this later on, very severe messages because they're in their own environment, sitting on the couch with their family, and they don't have to travel and weep in the taxi, or they can be at their own comforting environment. So especially those very difficult or deemed difficult situations prove to be very fit for this type of consultation. And it's not like it's not very fancy. It's not holograms or augmented reality or XR, but it's a major leap in using technology that we already use, but in a way that fits workflow of patients and also trustworthy portals of the patient. Yeah.
So, one of the things that I'm hearing is really this forward-leaning technology, a lot of XR, different sort of creative experimentations, but also maybe technologies that are already in our lives integrated today being extended just towards a different use. But I can't help to wonder, if you're in Singapore, if you're in Amsterdam, if you're in London, if you're in Washington, D.C., as I am, all of this sounds grand. I have wonderful internet connectivity, but how does that work for the rest of the world, right? There are parts of the world that don't have necessarily access to this technology yet. And yet you are doctors first, right? And so you are very much into, saving patients' life, working to make healthcare accessible to all. How are we seeing these technologies evolve to countries that haven't had access to them to date? I'm assuming it's very uneven, just like Zoom connectivity is uneven. Dr. Gao, why don't we start with you? I'm very curious to hear your perspectives, and how do we ensure accessibility and inclusivity for everybody around the globe to these new technologies that are coming into healthcare?
Sure. So you're perfectly right in the sense that there is an imbalance at this point in time, and I think that happens at the start of any new technology or new device that comes out. There will always be those with more resources and better infrastructure to access them, and there will always be those who have lesser resources or less well-developed infrastructure that may be lagging behind. And the way I see it is that in order for us to really democratize this technology and to include everyone, then those with the abilities to bring in this technology and devices like this early should try and share it as much as possible with those that may not be able to do it at this point in time, and to really help them develop their own programs. So one of the things that we are trying to do from NUHS and from the Hollow Association is that we work with various other medical associations for what we call outreach programs. We've been doing it virtually during the pandemic. We have virtual outreach programs either on Zoom or MS Teams, where we will connect some of the major centers or major institutes around the world with areas that are less well developed, with areas that are don't traditionally have access to high quality medical care, and essentially we built the bridge between them. So we built a bridge between them to try and bring some of the expertise from from the major centers and the more experts to areas like this that may not actually be possible without technologies like telehealth, telemedicine, virtual consults, and moving ahead to even including immersive technology. We are actually in the process of planning our next rounds of physical outreach programs where we will actually bring the technology to these places. So, we are planning a few outreach programs later on in the year where we will go to, lesser developed regions of the world, starting out in Asia, and we are sending teams, and we are equipping them with HoloLens, with mixed reality devices, with the necessary Wi-Fi devices, connections, and we are even exploring the potential of bringing our own satellite dish and our own satellite uplinks to these places, because we know that when we go to lesser developed countries and lesser developed regions, we can bring the hardware, but the back-end infrastructure and support may not be there, right? Like, most of us are using, 4G or 5G. We have good Wi-Fi connection in most of the developed countries and developed parts of the world. But, these areas, they may not even have 3G or 4G, right? So it becomes necessary for us to bring the infra along with us to help them start their services. It may just be an initial connection, an initial touch point, where they can have a few, remote assistance, remote proctoring sessions to begin with, but it is a foundation that we can build upon. We can see where the pain points are. We can understand their infrastructure, what they need, what is required for them to build up their own services. And it is, essentially, to me, it is up to, centers and institutes that have the capability to do so, really help all these areas that may not have the necessary resources or the infrastructure to develop on their own. And it's about bringing the expertise, sharing the experience, and sharing the resources to try and bridge as much of the gap as possible. So I've been asked whether immersive technologies like mixed reality, augmented reality is actually going to increase the divide and the division between more developed regions and lesser developed regions. So my view is that that's not necessarily true. It depends on how we intend to implement this. Of course, if let's say we decide to be selfish about it and we keep the good things for ourselves, and we say, okay, we're going to take it and run with it on our own, then yes, naturally that will increase the divide, and it will just make things the disparity even more obvious in the years to come. But on the flip side, we can say that we have the ability to really adopt this and to really help develop this. And all good things are meant to be shared, right? So if we develop something that we find it's useful, then share it with the world, bring it to those who can't develop on their own, those who don't have the resources to do it on their own, and to help them, increase their accessibility. And I think this is how the entire ecosystem should go, and I'm hoping that it's going to go this way in next few years.
Dr. Ahmed, I see you looking. I think you probably have a few comments you'd like to also add to this conversation around accessibility and inclusivity. And what does that mean, not just from maybe an ethical or a human perspective, but also ensuring that the technology is developed with representation of different people from different parts of the world, so that we can really understand the diversity of patients and how patient to patient might be differing needs or requirements inside of the XR environment?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. On the one side, you got something around, are we creating a bigger divide for healthcare by promoting technologies that we may be experiencing in, I guess, your first world countries or Western countries. But I think there's another side to the coin here. First of all, as technology becomes more commonplace, it becomes cheaper, more affordable. Always, there's a whole cycle of becoming more affordable. At this point, it's actually more cost effective at the moment. Also, we underestimate the power of the lower middle-income countries to think differently. We think that we know best, but actually our healthcare systems are failing appallingly. Actually, we don't know the best, and actually there may be other ways of working. What we see is leapfrogging. We're seeing countries that you might not expect to be very technology-enabled, leapfrogging our societies. Let's take an example. Money, for example. We've been using cash for a long time. Parts of Africa have been using mobile money for decades. They've abandoned the original currencies. They've gone digital on their smartphones. We have China with WeChat across the entire country with 1.2 billion people, access information in real time on their smartphones, booking tickets, insurance, hospital appointments, etc. So people are doing much more than we think they are. For example, I'm off to Morocco in a couple of weeks. And can you imagine Morocco actually have a big XR center trying to implement XR across the entire country? Who would have thought, right? But which country in the world is doing that at the moment on a national scale? Very few. So there's a lot to learn also from some of these countries that actually really leapfrogging our societies. At the same time, I think it's up to us to make sure that as these ideas develop and solutions we create are available to everybody. And that means having connectivity, having access, etc. And the world is more connected than it was before, Christina. We've now got 3G, 4G, now 5G, which will about 6 and 7G in the future. We've got Starlink from Elon Musk's satellite giving you good connectivity on the ground at the moment. We've got people thinking about how do we connect people more importantly. We've got major tech companies supporting that with funding and infrastructure. So I like to be an optimist. My glass is usually half full. So I think that we are working on the principle that all these technologies will allow us in the future to democratize healthcare, to make it more affordable and accessible. So I think there are a number of areas. It's not straightforward that we have all the resources here, we're not sharing it widely. Actually, it's more about a closer collaboration.
Thank you so much. I think that that's really a great way to almost end our webinar today. But I really want to return back full circle to Dr. Srivan on that note and say, look, you know what? More accessible technologies potentially There's already so much in play today, more to come. What are the really great things we should be looking at over the next 18, 24 months that you just think are going to revolutionize healthcare from an XR perspective? What should everybody be getting excited about?
Ooh, that's a big question. Well, I think it has been said by my colleagues as well. HTML5 platforms and the 5G network will help us all and will diminish the gap of inequality between countries and persons. So I think, the way forward is not in bulky machines or in high-end technology that needs lots of infrastructure to replace, but in apps, in games, in, technology that fits in the pocket, basically. One example I cannot resist of mentioning concerning your question about remote healthcare in countries that are in need. There has been a very big initiative to train nurses doing surgery, people without too much experience doing cataract surgery, fully trained on VR, and they now perform the cataract surgeries in low-income countries, and they do so very, very well. So in the end, you don't need an education of €1 million to have reliable healthcare to people in need. And I think that is what we must realize all together, how to make sure that high-end care is still being provided for those in need, but also high-end care is provided to those in need who are not next to us. And for that, we need to have smart solutions, and we can do it. It's just a matter of priority.
What a great way to wrap up our webinar today. We can do it. We have technologies that are coming to us to do it, but we're also being smart around using traditional workflows, ways of working, and understanding how to incorporate the old with the new for the best patient care moving forward. On that note, thank you so much for your time. I know you're all very busy. You're actually saving the lives of individuals and providing incredible care. So thank you for taking time out, and we look forward to hearing more from you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.